They thought it would be an easy target, a sleepy Arizona border town, a 12-year-old girl, a house with nothing but a silver-haired grandmother and an aging family dog. That was the story the cartel believed, and it would be the mistake that changed everything. Because the girl they were after was Emily Anderson, the granddaughter of a fallen DEA agent. And the dog they thought was harmless? He was Shadow, a veteran of 3 combat tours, a ghost of war who had once operated in the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, a legend among military K-9 units with a record of 57 confirmed enemy takedowns. To the cartel, Emily looked like a pawn they could snatch to force a desperate family to give up hidden evidence. But what they didn't realize was that her father had seen this day coming years ago, and he hadn't left his daughter defenseless. He had left her with a soldier. The morning air was cool, crisp, the desert sun just beginning to stretch its golden fingers across the quiet streets of Millbrook. Inside the modest 2-story home at the edge of town, Emily leaned against her bedroom window, watching Shadow patrol the backyard with the same relentless precision he had displayed overseas. Every morning without fail, he circled the perimeter 3 times, always clockwise, pausing at each corner, scanning the landscape with a soldier's wary eyes. To a stranger, it might have looked like the habits of a well-trained pet. But to anyone who knew the truth, every measured step, every calculated pause was a reminder that Shadow was no ordinary dog. He didn't walk the fence line out of habit. He was on patrol. Even now, even 2 years after the battlefield, his mission had never ended. Maggie Anderson, Emily's grandmother, appeared quietly in the doorway, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. Her eyes, lined with years of sorrow and strength, followed her granddaughter's gaze to the dog in the yard. "He's doing it again, isn't he?" she said softly. Emily nodded without speaking, her hand resting against the glass. 3 laps, always 3, always checking every corner twice, just like Dad had taught him. Maggie smiled sadly and placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, squeezing it with the silent communication that only family understands. "Your father knew exactly what he was doing when he made sure Shadow came to live with us," she whispered, more to herself than to Emily. Below, Shadow completed his 3rd circuit and paused, nose lifted to the breeze. His ears twitched once, then settled. All clear for now. Emily let herself breathe a little easier. She had seen it before, how quickly Shadow could move when he sensed a threat. She had seen him take down an armed burglar in their yard the year before the police could even respond to the silent alarm. She had seen the scars beneath his short fur, had sat beside him during thunderstorms when the noise of distant thunder would drag him back into some private hell of memory. She knew he wasn't just a protector. He was a survivor, carrying invisible wounds from battles she could only imagine. "Breakfast," Maggie said, breaking the moment with a soft nudge. Emily pulled herself away from the window reluctantly, leaving behind the sight of the desert slowly waking under the rising sun. In the kitchen, the routine continued. Shadow took his place near the back door, his posture alert but deceptively relaxed, his eyes flicking between windows, constantly scanning. Emily sat at the small wooden table, a bowl of cereal in front of her, the clink of a spoon against the bowl the only sound. Maggie moved quietly, washing dishes, her mind elsewhere, her body moving through the motions of a morning that felt too normal. "Remember when he first got here?" Emily said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Maggie glanced over her shoulder and nodded. "He wouldn't even sleep unless he could see every door," she said, her voice tinged with the bittersweet edge of memory. "Your father warned me, said Shadow would need time to adjust, said he wouldn't trust the world for a while, not after what they'd been through." She paused, drying her hands slowly, the towel twisting between her fingers. Those first few months were hard on everyone. Emily looked down at her cereal, pushing the pieces around aimlessly. She didn't need to be reminded. She remembered the day Shadow arrived, a week after 2 grim-faced officers had come to their door, after the folded flag, after the letter. Shadow had limped off the transport truck with haunted eyes and a worn leash. His left hind leg bore a faint limp from a gunshot wound that had never fully healed. But when he saw Emily for the first time, something shifted. He had pressed his head against her chest, trembling, and she had wrapped her arms around him as the dam inside her finally broke. Outside, a car door slammed in the distance, snapping Shadow's attention sharply to the front yard. His muscles tensed, head lowering, ears pricked forward. Emily and Maggie both froze. Through the kitchen window, they could see a black SUV slowly cruising past the house. Just another neighbor, maybe. Maybe not. It wasn't the first unfamiliar vehicle they'd seen this week. Maggie's hand drifted unconsciously toward the drawer where she kept her son's service weapon locked away. A chill passed through the room, invisible but palpable. Emily finished her cereal in silence. The house felt different this morning. Tighter, tenser. Shadow didn't relax, even after the SUV disappeared from view. He remained by the door, his body a coiled spring, ready to explode into action at the first wrong sound. And somewhere deep inside Emily, a small voice she had learned to never ignore whispered that today something was coming, something Shadow was already preparing for. And this time, it would not be a burglar or a passing storm. This time, it would be war. The cartel had been watching the Anderson house for weeks, studying the routines, the comings and goings, the faces that passed through the front door. To them, it looked like a soft target. A grandmother, a young girl, a house tucked away at the edge of a sleepy town with no immediate neighbors close enough to notice if something terrible happened. They took their surveillance photos, made their notes, checked for security systems, guards, weapons. They saw none of the things they usually feared. No armed guards at the door, no security cameras on the corners, just a dog lying lazily in the sun, a family pet. A Belgian Malinois, sure, but old enough to seem more sentimental than threatening. Just a dog, they thought, just an old war relic, if he even was that. They didn't bother digging deeper. They didn't see the scars hidden under his coat. They didn't hear about his reputation, how in his prime he had once single-handedly turned the tide of an ambush that would have wiped out an entire Special Forces unit overseas. They didn't understand that the name Shadow wasn't just a call sign. It was a warning, a reminder whispered among soldiers in dark places. If you see the Shadow first, you're already too late. The plan was simple. Hit the house while Emily was at school, neutralize the grandmother, tear the place apart, find the evidence James Anderson had died to hide. If they missed it, no matter. They'd grab the girl after school, use her as leverage. Maggie Anderson would talk. They all did, when their blood was threatened. And if she didn't, well, accidents happened all the time in quiet little towns like Millbrook. The cartel wasn't worried. They had numbers, they had firepower, and most importantly, they had the element of surprise. What they didn't have was an understanding of what it truly meant to face a soldier who had already lost everything, and who would rather die than lose again. Inside their makeshift mobile command post, a gutted-out delivery van parked behind an abandoned gas station just outside town, Marcus Drake scrolled through satellite images and property records. His men, hardened enforcers who once ran black ops south of the border, geared up silently around him. Weapons were loaded, radios checked, body armor strapped tight. Drake's mind ticked over the plan again and again. In and out, quick and clean. Hit the house, take the girl, squeeze the grandmother. No witnesses, no messes, just fear and compliance. He spoke into a secure phone, his voice cold and calm. Target is scheduled to leave for school in 30 minutes. House will be clear after that. Move on my command. The minutes crawled by. Across town, Emily packed her backpack, humming under her breath, unaware of the dark forces shifting into place. Shadow sat at the door, still as a statue, his eyes never leaving the driveway. Maggie glanced out the window, her unease sharpening. Another SUV cruised slowly past, then another. Too many strangers for such a small stretch of road. She gripped her coffee cup tighter. She could feel it in her bones. A storm building, silent but heavy. Emily kissed her grandmother goodbye and walked down the driveway, Shadow watching her the entire way, his body stiff with attention. He didn't move. That was part of the agreement. Shadow had been trained not to accompany Emily beyond the property without explicit orders. At school, she would be safer for now, or so they hoped. Across the street, unseen, a man lifted a phone to his ear. Target is moving. Dog remains at location. Green light confirmed. In the kitchen, Maggie pulled open the drawer where James's service pistol rested, fully loaded. She didn't take it out yet. But she stood there a long moment, her hand hovering, feeling the weight of every bad memory rise up inside her. Her son had warned her in the letter, had warned that if certain things happened, she would know, and she was beginning to know. 2 miles away, Drake clicked off the phone and turned to his team. 2 units at the house, 2 at the school for extraction. Keep it clean. Keep it quiet. His men nodded without hesitation. To them, this was just another job, another family to break, another life to ruin. They had no idea that the enemy waiting for them at the Anderson house had fought and survived real wars. Not the kind fought with bullets and blades alone, but the kind fought deep in the soul where mercy dies and only duty remains. Shadow shifted his weight by the door. He could smell the change in the air, the faint scent of oil and steel carried on the wind. He didn't know who was coming, but he knew what they meant. His entire body tensed, his mind racing through old commands, old instincts. Protect, defend, eliminate threats, save the family, no matter what. At St. Mary's Middle School, Emily sat in her math class, tapping her pencil against her desk, distracted. Something felt wrong, a pressure she couldn't explain. When she looked out the window, she caught a glimpse of 2 men standing by a parked car, pretending to check a clipboard, pretending not to stare at the building. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She thought about Shadow, about the way his ears would prick up before a thunderstorm, before danger. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. If it feels wrong, it is wrong. Trust it. At home, Maggie noticed the van parked farther down the road. Shadow's hackles rose the moment he saw it. Maggie didn't hesitate anymore. She pulled the pistol from the drawer, checked the chamber, and tucked it into her waistband. Somewhere deep inside her, the years of being a military nurse, of living through bombed-out cities and triage tents, kicked in. She didn't panic. She prepared. Back at the cartel's mobile command, Drake's radio crackled to life. Position ready. Moving on your go. He checked his watch, calculated distances, margins, risks. It didn't matter. This would be over in an hour, tops. He smiled a thin, humorless smile. Go. And in that moment, as 4 vehicles peeled away from hiding spots and headed toward their targets, the cartel stepped into a battle they were utterly unprepared for. They thought they were walking into a house guarded by an old woman and a tired old dog. What they were actually about to face was the unleashed fury of a ghost from a forgotten battlefield, a ghost that remembered exactly what it meant to fight, to protect, and to never, ever surrender. The first mistake the cartel made was assuming they were the only ones watching. They believed their black SUVs, their rented vans, their men posted at street corners and inside parked cars were invisible to a sleepy town that rarely locked its doors. But they had not counted on Shadow. Every morning for 2 years, Shadow had memorized the landscape of Millbrook from the Anderson house. Every neighbor's car, every delivery truck that rolled past, every jogger, every cyclist, every stray sound that didn't belong. He knew the normal patterns of life here the same way he had once memorized the deadly patterns of foreign battlefields, and it took only the slightest shift, a breath of unfamiliar oil on the breeze, the subtle distortion of tires slowing a little too long by the curb, to tell him that something was wrong. Shadow's morning patrol was already complete when he sensed the change, but instinct drove him to recheck the perimeter. His movements were methodical, his pace measured to not draw attention. He circled back to the front door, ears flicking, nose twitching at the faint traces of gun oil and unfamiliar boots pressed against the pavement 2 blocks down. In his mind, the old training programs triggered like falling dominoes. Threat indicators, multiple unknown vehicles, behavioral markers, repeated slow passes, environmental shifts, unfamiliar human scents carrying tension, adrenaline, weapon lubricant. Shadow didn't need to see the threat to know it was coming. His body stiffened at the porch steps, his muscles coiling beneath his thick coat like a drawn bowstring. Inside the house, Maggie moved quietly, seemingly unaware, but her sharp eyes caught the small cues. The way Shadow's tail lowered, not in fear, but in readiness. The way he pivoted at slight sounds, not toward them, but to the fallback defensive positions he had mapped instinctively throughout the home. Maggie's own instincts flared to life, the buried reflexes of a woman who had survived war zones halfway around the world. She pulled the curtains shut, but not too fast, not too obviously. She checked the locks without appearing panicked. Every move she made was calculated to avoid triggering early aggression from whoever was out there watching. Across town at St. Mary's Middle School, Emily sat restlessly at her desk. The numbers on the chalkboard blurred together. Something gnawed at her, a cold, prickling sense she couldn't shake. Twice during morning recess, she had caught glimpses of the same two men, the ones who didn't belong, lingering near the fence line. When Mrs. Baker, her teacher, had confronted them, they'd offered flimsy smiles and an excuse about surveying the grounds. But Emily had seen the way their eyes moved, tracking, cataloguing, and she remembered what her father had taught her during long backyard talks when Shadow lay dozing in the sun nearby. If your gut tells you something's wrong, Em, don't ignore it. Your instincts are smarter than you realize. She tapped her pencil against the desk in a steady rhythm, trying to ground herself, but the cold dread coiled tighter in her chest with every passing minute. At the Anderson home, another car rolled by, slower this time, lingering at the mailbox before creeping forward. Shadow moved, almost imperceptibly, placing himself between Maggie and the front window. His lips peeled back just enough to flash a glimpse of sharp teeth, his entire frame humming with suppressed energy. Maggie exhaled slowly, reaching for the drawer where the weapon waited, feeling the weight of old decisions pressing down on her. She thought of James, thought of the letter he left, thought of the dog he had entrusted to her care, not just as a guardian, but as the final piece of a plan carefully stitched together long before his death. Across the town, in a parking lot behind an abandoned gas station, Marcus Drake adjusted his earpiece and checked his watch again. Everything was aligning exactly as planned. 2 extraction teams at the school, 2 breach teams for the house, swift, overwhelming force. They would snatch the girl at pickup, apply pressure on the grandmother if necessary, and secure the hidden evidence James Anderson had died to protect. Drake felt no fear, only a cold, metallic certainty. This was just another job. Another asset retrieval in a 1,000-mile trail of broken lives and silenced witnesses. He didn't know that the house he was about to attack wasn't a soft civilian residence. It was a trap designed by a dead man who had foreseen every move they would make, and it was defended by something far more dangerous than he could imagine, something patient, brutal, and infinitely loyal. At school, the first fire drill of the day blared unexpectedly. Students shuffled toward the exits in loose lines. But Emily hesitated. She glanced at the office where the substitute teacher, the man with the 2 clean shoes and the muscle beneath his coat, watched the crowd a little too closely. Fear gripped her, but so did her training. Her father's voice echoed in her memory again. If it feels wrong, don't run the way they expect. Think. Move sideways when they think you'll run straight. Heart-hammering, she ducked sideways into the library instead of joining the herd. She crouched low behind the towering shelves, watching from the shadows as the so-called substitute began drifting against the flow of students, his eyes scanning for one face, hers. Back at the Anderson house, Maggie slid the pistol into the back of her waistband and walked briskly through the kitchen, gathering the bare essentials she might need. Her hand brushed the locked drawer where a second envelope rested, James's final instructions, meant to be opened only when the time came. She didn't open it yet, not yet, but she could feel the moment tightening around her like a noose. Outside, Shadow stiffened. His nose twitched once, twice. He growled low in his throat, the sound too deep to be mistaken for anything but a warning. A black service van rolled to a stop directly across the street. Men climbed out slowly, purposefully. Maggie met Shadow's eyes across the room. No commands were needed, no words. In the bond between soldier and guardian, between mother and warrior, everything was already understood. They were out of time. At the school, Emily slipped through a side door, heart pounding, her every step a whispered prayer that Shadow would somehow know, somehow come for her. She didn't know that he was already moving, that the old training had already triggered, and that the ghost the cartel thought was just a dog was about to show them what real war looked like. The first move came without fanfare, no roaring engines, no shouting orders. Just a quiet ripple through the streets of Millbrook as the first black SUV pulled to a stop 2 blocks away from the Anderson home, and a second vehicle glided into position by the elementary school's side gate. In the calm before the storm, ordinary life continued. Sprinklers hissed across tidy lawns, neighbors sipped their morning coffees. A mailman walked his route unaware of the violence preparing to erupt beneath the desert sun. But for those attuned to it, those who had spent their lives in places where peace could shatter in an instant, the signs were unmistakable. Shadow stiffened at the threshold of the house, every muscle in his body locking into combat readiness. Maggie saw it in the way his ears sharpened, the way his breathing slowed, the way his entire focus turned into a taut wire stretched toward danger. She didn't need to see the threat herself. She trusted the dog's instincts more than her own. Across town, Emily's small fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack as she hid behind the library's tallest shelf. Through the narrow slats between books, she watched the supposed substitute teacher scan the empty hallway, his movements too purposeful, too slow, his hand brushing the edge of the earpiece barely concealed behind his hair. She could almost hear her father's voice in her mind, calm and firm. "If you ever feel cornered, don't panic. Look for the third option. There's always a third option." Emily's eyes darted to the library's emergency exit, half hidden behind a cart of returned books. She measured the distance, the timing, her pulse pounding against her ribs like a drumbeat. At the Anderson house, the men moved in casual formation, wearing the uniforms of a fake utility company, clipboards tucked under one arm, sidearms hidden under jackets. They crossed the street in twos, looking for all the world like linemen inspecting a faulty transformer. But Shadow wasn't fooled by their disguises. He knew the rhythm of predation when he saw it. He knew how killers moved. Maggie stepped back from the window, pulling the service weapon free, flipping the safety off with a quiet, practiced movement. Her heart pounded steadily, but her hands were steady. She had seen worse than this before. She had survived field hospitals where the air reeked of blood and smoke, where the walls shook with mortars and every knock at the door might bring wounded or death. She wasn't about to let fear take her now. The first knock at the door came sharp, too loud for courtesy. "Morning, Mum. Utility inspection," a voice called, falsely cheerful. Maggie didn't answer. Instead, she backed quietly toward the panic room door hidden in the hallway, reaching for the sealed envelope her son had left her. If James was right, and he usually was, this wasn't an inspection. It was the opening move in a siege. At the school, Emily took a breath, low and controlled, and made her move. She bolted toward the emergency door, the heavy backpack swinging behind her. The fake substitute shouted something, but Emily was already through, kicking the door open with a sharp clang that rang down the empty halls. Outside, the heat hit her like a wall, but she didn't slow down. She sprinted toward the maintenance yard behind the cafeteria, where a broken section of chain-link fence offered a narrow escape. Shadow heard the emergency door slam from across town. Even though he couldn't see her, even though the sounds were faint and distant, something inside him registered the change. Some part of his mind, tuned for years to the signals of battle, understood that the mission had shifted. Protect the house, protect Maggie, yes. But now Emily was in immediate danger, and the chain that had been holding his instincts in check snapped. The men on the porch grew impatient. When Maggie didn't answer, one of them tried the doorknob, rattling it sharply. Maggie whispered to Shadow one word, "Ready." The dog's body tensed, his entire frame vibrating with suppressed energy. She knew she had maybe 20 seconds before they forced entry. 20 seconds to either disappear into the panic room or to fight. She chose the latter. The first blow hit the door, splintering the frame but not breaking it. Maggie waited, pistol raised, her back against the wall, her breathing shallow but controlled. Shadow lowered himself into a crouch beside her, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. They came again, harder. The door cracked. Maggie squeezed the trigger once, sending a warning shot into the ceiling. The sharp crack echoed through the house like a starting gun. Outside, the men cursed and pulled weapons. No more pretending. The assault had begun. Across town, Emily reached the broken fence and slipped through, her palms scraping against the rusted wire. She didn't know where to go, only that she had to keep moving. The old church across the street caught her eye. She remembered her father once mentioning something about it, something about hidden places, tunnels maybe. She ran toward it without looking back. At the Anderson house, the door gave way with a crash. Shadow exploded into motion, hitting the first man in the doorway with brutal precision. 80 pounds of trained fury drove into the attacker's center mass, teeth clamping down on his gun hand with surgical accuracy. The man screamed as the weapon clattered to the floor. Maggie didn't hesitate. She fired again, the bullet hitting the wall inches from the second man's face, forcing him to dive for cover. The third and fourth men hesitated, not expecting resistance this fierce, this fast. Shadow didn't give them time to rethink. He pivoted, his body moving low and fast, slamming into the second attacker, sending him sprawling into the coffee table. The man's head hit the edge with a sickening thud. Blood smeared the carpet. Maggie used the chaos to retreat toward the hallway, toward the panic room door she knew they could not breach without serious explosives. She didn't plan to hide in it, not yet. She needed the second envelope inside. She needed James's final instructions. Shadow held his ground, standing over the downed men, growling deep and low. His eyes blazed with the old fire, the ancient instinct of the guardian. The attackers scrambled back toward the front door, bleeding, swearing, radioing desperately for backup. At the church, Emily banged on the side door, praying someone would answer. Betty Wilson, their elderly neighbor, appeared around the side, keys jingling in her hand. Without a word, she ushered Emily inside. Emily gasped out the words between sobs of breath. They're after me." Betty's face hardened in a way Emily had never seen before. "I know, sweetheart. Your father warned me this day might come." And somewhere across town, behind the cracked and splintered door of the Anderson home, Shadow stood ready once more. His body bled from shallow cuts, his left leg limping slightly from the old injury that had never fully healed. But his spirit was unbroken, his mission unchanged. Protect the house, protect the family, fight until there was nothing left to fight. The first battle was over, but the real war was just beginning, and the soldiers the cartel thought they were hunting had just revealed themselves to be something far, far worse than anything they had ever prepared for. The silence after the first fight was thick and suffocating, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the low, steady growl rumbling deep in Shadow's throat. Maggie didn't waste a second. She knelt beside the sealed panic room door, her fingers trembling just slightly as she worked the old mechanical lock James had insisted on installing. No electronics, no remote access, nothing that could be jammed or hacked. She swung the door open and pulled the heavy metal box from its hiding place inside. James's second envelope waited for her, sealed tightly, her son's handwriting scrawled across the front. "Open only when the wolves come." She didn't hesitate. She tore the envelope open with a grimace and unfolded the letter, the paper worn soft from the countless times she had touched it but never dared to break the seal. The first line hit her like a hammer. "If you're reading this, they're here. You know what to do. Trust Shadow. Follow the plan. Don't look back." Maggie clutched the letter to her chest for a heartbeat before forcing herself to move. She grabbed the small secured case from the panic room, a case she now knew held the real reason the cartel was here. Not just hidden evidence, not just files, but the key to exposing a network of corruption stretching far beyond their quiet town. A network James had uncovered piece by piece in the last desperate months of his life. She glanced once at Shadow, who had returned to his post by the broken door, every muscle vibrating with tension, his intelligent eyes scanning the street beyond. He was waiting for her to make the next move, waiting for her to give the command he had been trained to follow if the worst ever happened. Across town, Betty Wilson guided Emily through the darkened halls of the church with surprising speed for a woman of her years. Betty's face, usually warm and crinkled with a kindly smile, was now grim, focused. She pulled Emily into a side room, bolting the heavy oak door behind them. "Your daddy showed me something years ago," Betty said in a hushed voice, dragging a battered rug aside to reveal a trapdoor in the floor. "Back when he started suspecting things, he said if anything ever happened, if men ever came looking for you or your grandmother, you were to go underground." She grunted as she hauled open the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Come on, sweetheart, we don't have much time." Emily hesitated only a second before following. She knew better than to question it. If her father had planned it, if Shadow would have led her this way, it was the right move. Always trust the plan. Back at the Anderson home, Maggie clipped a harness onto Shadow, a specialized tactical rig James had left with instructions for emergency deployments. As soon as the buckles clicked into place, Shadow seemed to transform again, the last traces of the family pet disappearing, leaving behind only the war dog, the elite K9, the weapon. Maggie ran her hand down his flank once, briefly, a gesture of gratitude and farewell rolled into one. "Protect her," she whispered. "Protect Emily." Shadow's ears flicked once in acknowledgement, as if he understood every word, every unspoken plea carried in her voice. Outside, the sounds of more vehicles filled the morning air. The second wave was coming. The first team had failed, and now Drake was unleashing his heavy hitters. Men with heavier weapons, thicker armor, fewer scruples. Maggie didn't have long. She moved quickly to the back of the house, opened the hidden hatch to the old maintenance tunnel James had retrofitted years ago. It was crude, narrow, half forgotten even by the utility company, but it led under the street, toward the abandoned rail yard 2 miles away, and more importantly, it led to one of James's carefully placed fallback points. Shadow hesitated only long enough for Maggie to give a final nod. Then he slipped into the tunnel, his powerful body moving low and silent through the darkness, a living missile aimed directly at the girl he was sworn to protect. In the streets of Millbrook, Marcus Drake adjusted his earpiece and cursed under his breath as the first report came in. 2 men incapacitated, 1 critically wounded by what dispatch only described as some kind of animal attack. Drake wasn't stupid. He had worked too many jobs where trained dogs were part of the defenses, but he had never seen a single dog do this much damage, this fast. He ordered more men to the Anderson house, tightening the noose, determined to find what James Anderson had hidden. Time was running out. At the church, Emily and Betty moved quickly through the underground passages, the stale air thick with dust and memory. Betty's flashlight flickered along the rough walls, revealing old graffiti, long-forgotten signs from Prohibition days, when smugglers had used these tunnels to move liquor across the border. "Your father spent months down here," Betty murmured, half to herself, mapping it, reinforcing it, training that dog to know every twist and turn. Emily followed close, trusting that somewhere, somehow, Shadow was already hunting for her. Above ground, the Cartel teams swept the church grounds, radios crackling as they coordinated their search. They kicked in doors, ransacked the empty Sunday school classrooms, barked orders at terrified staff members, but they were searching blindly. James had ensured that the only way to follow Emily now was to think like a soldier, not like a thug. At the Anderson home, the second assault began with a flashbang hurled through the shattered front door. The explosion rocked the house, but Maggie had already retreated deep into the interior, using the chaos to buy precious minutes. The men poured into the house, armed to the teeth, tactical gear gleaming under the rising sun, but they found only bloodstains, broken furniture, and empty halls. No evidence, no targets, and no dog. Shadow moved like a phantom through the underground routes, nose low, ears flicking, every muscle tuned to a singular mission: find Emily, protect her at all costs. He ignored the sense of rats, mold, stagnant water. His senses were locked onto the faint, precious trail of his girl, the one he had been entrusted with, the one he would die to save. Drake, furious now, coordinated his forces for a broader sweep. He sent teams to the rail yard, to the maintenance yards, to the surrounding neighborhoods. He had no idea that every move he made was anticipated, countered, prepared for by a man who had known he might not live to fight this battle himself, but had left behind a weapon that didn't need orders, only loyalty. Emily and Betty emerged into a disused utility building behind the church grounds. Betty leaned heavily against the wall, breathing hard. "You keep going, honey," she said, pressing a set of keys into Emily's palm. "Old Ranger Station. Follow the tracks till you see it. Shadow will find you there." Tears burned Emily's eyes, but she nodded. She was her father's daughter. She had to keep moving. She slipped through the cracked door and sprinted across the empty field, heart pounding, unaware that even now a dark shape moved behind her through the shadows, closing the distance with every silent step. Shadow had found her trail, and woe to anyone who stood in his way. The first blood was drawn not by gunfire, not by blades, but by teeth, precision, and fury. The moment the first attacker crossed the shattered threshold into the Anderson home, Shadow was already moving. No bark, no warning, just the sudden eruption of 80 pounds of hardened muscle trained to disable, disarm, and destroy. The man had a pistol up, sweeping the room mechanically, but he never got a shot off. Shadow hit him like a missile, jaws locking onto the attacker's dominant wrist, his entire body twisting in a brutal torque that snapped bones and ripped the weapon free. The man screamed, dropping the gun as he crumpled backward, and Shadow, moving seamlessly from years of combat training, pivoted mid-air and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him crashing into the end table with enough force to crack the wood. The scream brought the others running, weapons raised, adrenaline kicking in, but they were too slow. Maggie was already in motion, backing down the hall toward the safe room, but not running. She moved carefully, controlled, her father's pistol raised in both hands, her steps practiced from years of field hospital combat zones. The second man burst into the living room, scanning for threats, only to catch a bullet splintering the doorframe inches from his head. Maggie didn't aim to kill yet, but she didn't need to. She only needed to sow fear, hesitation, confusion. Shadow would do the rest. The third man, younger, less disciplined, shouted something and charged. Shadow barely needed a signal. He swung around, his jaws releasing the first man, and lunged at the new threat. His teeth found purchase on the man's thigh, precisely where the artery pulsed under the skin. Shadow didn't bite to kill. He bit to cripple, exactly as he had been trained. The man shrieked and fell, clutching his leg, dropping his weapon. Blood sprayed in rhythmic spurts, staining the carpet crimson. The fourth man hesitated, gun wavering, instincts at war with training. He had been told they would be facing civilians, a grandmother, a family dog. He hadn't been briefed for this, for a war dog who moved faster than thought, for a woman who fired with deadly precision. Shadow pressed the advantage. He feinted left, drawing the man's gun away, then lunged low, knocking the attacker's legs out from under him. The man crashed to the floor with a grunt, his weapon clattering away into the corner. In seconds, the living room was a scene of devastation, broken furniture, blood staining the walls, 4 men incapacitated before they could even radio a full alert. Maggie fired one more shot, this time hitting the floor inches from a twitching hand reaching for a dropped weapon. "Stay down," she barked, her voice steady, commanding, the voice of a woman who had seen enough death to know when to show mercy and when to end a fight. Shadow growled low in his throat, standing over the heap of bodies like a hellhound loosed from some forgotten battlefield. His teeth were bared, blood dripping from his muzzle, but his eyes were clear, calculating. He wasn't out of control. He wasn't wild. He was a soldier executing his mission with terrifying precision. Outside, the second wave of cartel enforcers slammed their SUV doors and moved in. They weren't pretending anymore. They weren't hiding behind fake utility uniforms or flimsy excuses. They came in tactical gear, armored vests, automatic weapons slung low against their hips. They moved like professionals, not cartel thugs, but military contractors, former special forces sold to the highest bidder. They advanced on the Anderson house with formation and discipline, calling out positions, covering angles, moving with silent, deadly efficiency. Drake wasn't taking any more chances, but every second they spent approaching was a second Maggie used to activate the next stage of James Anderson's plan. She retreated through the house, pulling a hidden latch behind a coat rack, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the old service tunnels James had reinforced during his final months. She didn't need to tell Shadow what to do. The dog fell in beside her naturally, his wounded leg favoring slightly, but his body still humming with readiness. Maggie keyed in the simple mechanical code, the heavy steel door sliding closed behind them just as the first breaching charges hit the house with concussive blasts. Wood and plaster exploded inward as the front walls caved. The second team poured into the ruins, weapons at the ready, searching for survivors, for the evidence they had been promised would be here. But all they found was wreckage and the bodies of their own men, still groaning where they lay broken on the floor. Across town, Emily ran along the edge of the abandoned rail yard, her heart hammering against her ribs, her lungs burning. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to curl up somewhere dark and small, but she forced herself to keep moving. The sun beat down on her from above, turning the cracked dirt and twisted metal into a shimmering, distorted landscape of heat and fear. She spotted the old ranger station up ahead, a squat building of sun-bleached wood and rusted steel shutters, and pushed herself harder. Behind her, in the shifting shadows of the rail yard, movement flickered. Dark figures slipping between boxcars, tracking her, herding her. She wasn't just running randomly. They were forcing her toward something, a trap maybe. But Emily remembered her father's lessons. When they think they have you boxed in, that's when you turn the whole game upside down. She didn't know how yet, but she trusted that if she kept moving, if she kept thinking, the opportunity would come. And then she heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound that froze her blood and gave her hope all at once. A low, sharp bark, one short, two long, the signal, Shadow's signal. He was close. He had found her. Shadow burst from the side alley like a phantom, his body low, his movement impossibly fast. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, placing himself between Emily and the advancing figures without hesitation. His presence alone seemed to slow the pursuers. The nearest man, tall, broad, wearing tactical gear and carrying a suppressed submachine gun, barked a command into his radio. "Dogs here. Repeat, the dogs here. Target not alone." But there was an edge to his voice now, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Shadow didn't give them time to regroup. With a bark that ripped through the heavy air like a gunshot, he lunged forward, targeting the lead man. Emily froze in awe as she watched the trained fury unfold. Shadow didn't attack blindly. Every move was calculated, trained, perfected. He weaved between gun barrels, knocked the weapon from one man's hands with a brutal shoulder check, twisted mid-air to snap at the calf of another attacker, forcing him to stumble and fire wildly into the dirt. Emily didn't wait. She sprinted for the ranger station's broken side door, Shadow covering her retreat with a ferocity that stunned even the hardened mercenaries chasing them. Blood splattered the cracked pavement. Men shouted for reinforcements. Radios crackled with panic. The trap they had set for Emily was collapsing under the weight of their own underestimation, under the weight of a soldier they had dismissed as nothing more than a family pet. Inside the ranger station, Emily slammed the door behind her, bolting it with shaking hands. She turned, searching the dim interior for the next move, for whatever James Anderson had hidden here. Shadow appeared a second later, blood on his muzzle. his chest heaving, but his eyes sharp, alert, waiting for her to lead. She understood then. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting with her. She was part of the plan too. Outside, more vehicles screeched to a halt on the cracked asphalt. More armed men poured out, fanning through the rail yard, tightening the noose. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that James Anderson hadn't just planned for an ambush. He had planned for a siege, and the defenders weren't ordinary civilians. They were a 12-year-old girl trained to think like a soldier and a war dog who had already survived battles worse than anything the cartel could unleash. Shadow growled low as the first breach team approached the door, and Emily gritted her teeth, backing toward the heavy steel hatch James had bolted into the ranger station's basement, the next step of the plan waiting just below her feet. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The pounding on the ranger station's door came fast and furious, fists hammering, boots kicking, voices barking orders in a language of violence that needed no translation. Emily backed toward the far end of the station, the heavy duffel bag her father had hidden here clutched tight in her arms. Shadow stayed between her and the door, body low, ears forward, every muscle coiled to strike. He didn't bark, he didn't snarl. True warriors didn't waste noise on warnings. They simply waited for the first opportunity to strike, and when it came, they made it final. The wood around the lock splintered with the first kick. The second cracked it clean through. The third sent the door swinging inward with a crash. But Emily was already moving, racing across the cracked concrete floor to the hatch her father had shown her once, long ago, under the guise of a secret fort. Back then, it had just been a game. Now it was the razor-thin line between life and death. She dropped the bag, scrambled with shaking hands at the latch, feeling the old bolts rasp against rusted hinges. Shadow didn't move until the first black-clad figure stepped fully into the room, weapon raised. Then he unleashed. He hit the lead attacker squarely in the ribs, knocking him off his feet and into the second man behind him. Guns clattered, boots slipped, curses flew. Shadow moved like a living weapon, slashing sideways to drive another man into a battered filing cabinet. The attackers fired blindly, panicking under the sudden, invisible assault. Rounds punched holes in the walls, shattering glass and kicking up choking clouds of dust. But Shadow was already gone from the spot they aimed at, weaving low, striking hard, moving faster than they could track. Emily yanked the hatch open and slid into the darkness below. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She remembered what her father had taught her. Fear is natural. Panic is a choice. She chose survival. Shadow was already at her heels, spinning at the hatch entrance to face the oncoming rush. He backed down the ladder only after Emily cleared the bottom, dropping into the underground tunnels James Anderson had built into the very bones of the station. The darkness swallowed them whole, but Emily didn't need her eyes to know Shadow was there. She could feel his presence at her side, the low rumble in his throat vibrating through the still air. She clicked on the flashlight from the bag and revealed the path ahead, narrow, cramped, lined with rotted beams and rusted support pipes. The way her father had shown her once, whispering about back doors and emergency exits while pretending it was all a big adventure. Only now did she understand the weight behind his words, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he explained the tunnels. He had always known this day might come. Above them, heavy boots pounded the floor. Voices barked out search commands. Some were confused. Some were furious. None realized how badly they had already lost the advantage. James Anderson had prepared for this. He had mapped every escape route, anticipated every breach point, built redundancy into every plan. And now his daughter and the dog he had trusted with his family's life were executing that plan with deadly precision. Emily pushed forward through the tight corridor, heart hammering, the duffel bag thudding against her side with every step. Inside were more tools her father had left for her: maps, encrypted radios, coded documents, everything she would need to keep running, keep fighting. She knew they couldn't stay underground forever. This wasn't about hiding. It was about surviving long enough to turn the hunters into the hunted. Behind them, a metallic clang echoed down the tunnel, the hatch above slamming open wider, boots descending the metal ladder. They were coming. Shadow twisted, planting himself behind Emily, placing his body between her and the incoming danger without hesitation. His nose twitched once, catching the scent of gun oil and fear. His ears flicked, calibrating the echo of approaching footsteps. He growled once, low and sharp, then moved. Swift as thought, he darted back toward the approaching enemies, positioning himself at a choke point where the narrow walls would strip the attackers of their numbers advantage. The first man dropped into view, sweeping his rifle back and forth. Shadow leapt. Teeth met flesh. The man screamed as the weight of the dog drove him against the tunnel wall, knocking his weapon free. Shadow didn't stay long enough to be pinned. He released instantly, spinning to slash at the next pair descending. His strategy was brutal, efficient. Slow them down, sow chaos, force them to reconsider every step. Emily didn't wait for the outcome. Her father had taught her better. If you can't win the fight, outrun it. Survival first, vengeance later. She sprinted down the tunnel, flashlight bobbing wildly, following the chalk markings James had left on the walls years ago. Tiny arrows, invisible unless you knew what to look for. Above ground, Marcus Drake realized too late that the situation was slipping from his control. The team at the ranger station reported back. Heavy resistance, multiple injuries, tunnel system unknown. His hands tightened into fists as he barked new orders into his headset. Seal the exits, cut off the town, full perimeter lockdown. No one gets out. Find the dog, find the girl, now. The town of Millbrook, sleepy and unsuspecting, began to transform under the cartel's occupation. Black SUVs rolled through residential streets. Men in tactical gear set up checkpoints, posing as law enforcement, flashing fake badges. They knocked on doors, asked questions, scanned faces. But every move they made was visible, every violation of jurisdiction recorded, because Detective Parker had already sounded the alarm. Because the evidence James Anderson had hidden wasn't just in files and hard drives. It was also in the actions the cartel would inevitably take once they thought they had free rein. Emily reached a fork in the tunnels and hesitated, heart slamming against her ribs like a drum. Left led deeper underground, toward the old mine shafts her father had warned about. Right curved upward, toward the rail tracks and another safe house hidden among the industrial ruins. Shadow appeared at her side an instant later, muzzle bloody, breathing hard but unbowed. He nosed at the right-hand tunnel firmly, then growled low, as if daring her to hesitate. She didn't. She turned right, bolting up the incline as the air grew fresher, lighter. Footsteps echoed behind them, frustrated, slower now. Whoever was chasing them was injured, tired, afraid. Good. They should be afraid, because they weren't hunting a scared little girl anymore. They were chasing a soldier's daughter and the last living weapon of a dead man who had built his revenge carefully, patiently, knowing it would unfold long after he was gone. They broke into daylight at the edge of the rail yard, behind a crumbling wall of concrete and twisted rebar. Emily gasped at the sudden brightness but didn't slow. She pulled the map from her bag, quickly tracing the route her father had drawn, a zigzagging path through the industrial ruins, avoiding open spaces, moving from cover to cover, always staying one step ahead. Shadow nudged her once, an almost gentle push, then moved forward, taking point once again. The duffel bag weighed heavy on her back, but Emily squared her shoulders and followed without hesitation. Somewhere behind them, in the wreckage of the old ranger station, Drake's men regrouped, furious and bloodied, but determined. They thought they could still catch her. They thought overwhelming force would fix what cunning and planning had already undone. They were wrong, because James Anderson had always understood the simple truth of war. It isn't the strongest who win. It's the ones who refuse to break. And his daughter, guided by the ghost of his training and the relentless loyalty of the war dog at her side, was about to teach the cartel that lesson the hard way. The industrial ruins of Millbrook stretched out before Emily like a broken, twisted maze of metal and concrete. Rusted loading docks sagged under the weight of years, shattered glass crunched underfoot, and graffiti stained every wall with warnings left behind by kids who thought they were the first to discover these forgotten places. But today, these ruins weren't abandoned. Today, they would become the battlefield her father had prepared for. Emily tightened the straps of her duffel bag and followed Shadow across the cracked concrete, staying low, moving from cover to cover just like her father had taught her during those summer afternoons he'd called games, but which she now understood had been training all along. Above them, drones buzzed faintly, unseen but ever-present, and Shadow's ears flicked at the sound. He led her not in a straight line but in a weaving, broken path, always avoiding open spaces, always keeping one step ahead of the invisible eyes tracking their movement. Behind them, Drake's men fanned out through the ruins, moving with military precision. They didn't shout. They didn't call orders. They moved in silent signals and tight formations, a predator's patience and deadliness in every step. But every move they made, every angle they thought they had covered, had been anticipated by a man who had built this gauntlet specifically for them. James Anderson had walked these ruins hundreds of times, dragging Emily and Shadow through every possible escape route, every bolt hole and hiding spot. He had laid traps not with explosives or alarms, but with terrain, with choke points, with escape paths that narrowed until the hunters became the hunted. Emily led Shadow into a collapsed warehouse where twisted steel beams jutted out of the ground like broken bones. Inside, sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the rubble. She crouched behind a fallen girder, pulling out one of the devices her father had packed in the duffel, a small black box with a blinking red light and a series of coded buttons, a portable scrambler. It wouldn't stop the cartel's drones completely, but it would disrupt their feeds, distort their signals, give her a temporary blind spot to slip through. She clicked it on and waited, counting the beats of her heart. 3 seconds later, a ripple passed through the ruins. Drones staggered in the sky, their buzzing growing erratic. Radios crackled with static. Drake's men cursed quietly, adjusting their gear, suddenly unsure of where their prey had gone. Emily didn't wait for them to recover. She bolted from the warehouse, Shadow hot on her heels, weaving between collapsed walls and overgrown shipping containers. She knew where she had to go, the safe house her father had marked on the map, the one tucked behind the old water treatment plant at the very edge of town. Behind her, Drake's fury boiled over. Reports came in scattered, confused. Visual lost, moving to intercept, possible location at Sector 4. He smashed his fist against the dashboard of his mobile command vehicle, snarling into the radio. "I don't care how you do it. Lock down every street, find the girl. Kill the dog if you have to, but bring me that evidence." But even as he barked orders, Drake was realizing something that chilled him to his core. This wasn't a random escape. It was orchestrated. Every step Emily took, every turn Shadow led her through, forced his men into predictable patterns, into exposures, into places where they had to reveal their weapons, their tactics, their communications. They were being herded, not by chance, but by design, and every move they made was being recorded, by police scanners, by hastily deployed FBI surveillance teams, by hidden cameras James Anderson had installed and left dormant until today. The evidence wasn't just hidden in files, it was being created in real time. Emily reached the water treatment plant just as the sun reached its highest point, the dry heat baking the ruins into a shimmering mirage of steel and dust. The old gates were chained, rusted nearly shut, but Shadow didn't even hesitate. He crouched, then sprang up, clambering over the fence with the same fluid strength he had once used to clear barricades in war zones halfway across the world. Emily followed, struggling slightly but fueled by adrenaline, determination, and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Inside the yard, the safe house looked like nothing more than an abandoned maintenance shed. But Emily knew better. Her father had spent months reinforcing it, outfitting it with steel plating beneath the wood, securing it with traps and escape routes invisible to the untrained eye. She pulled open the warped door and slipped inside, heart hammering in her ears. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through cracks, but otherwise it was silent, waiting. She pulled the second case from the floorboards, a hard-shell black container marked with her father's initials. Inside were more drives, more documents, and, most importantly, a small tactical tablet already connected to a secure satellite uplink. She powered it on, entering the code her father had drilled into her memory. The tablet sprang to life, immediately linking to remote servers and dead drops James had set up all over the country. Files began to sync, to upload, to push outward into channels that couldn't be stopped, couldn't be erased. Across Millbrook, FBI command picked up the sudden burst of transmissions. Detective Parker's team moved swiftly to trace the signals, their agents deploying to reinforce choke points, to intercept cartel convoys, to prepare for a full-scale takedown. Meanwhile, Drake's men finally realized where Emily had gone. Radio calls crackled with urgency. Converging on the water plant, Teams 3 and 5 moving into position. Engines roared to life. Vehicles tore through empty streets. Snipers took up overwatch positions atop abandoned buildings. Drake leaned forward in his seat, eyes narrowed. Trap her, now. But Shadow was already moving. The Belgian Malinois pressed his body against Emily's side, urging her toward the secondary exit, a concealed hatch at the back of the safe house that led into the storm drainage tunnels. The main approach to the plant was a killing field, wide open and easy to pin down. But the back? The back was a sniper's nightmare, blind turns, high walls, low cover, no clean angles. James had known the difference, and he had trained Emily to know it too. Emily clutched the tablet to her chest and sprinted through the hatch, Shadow darting ahead to clear the path. Behind them, the rumble of approaching vehicles grew louder, closer. Shots rang out, kicking up dust and shards of concrete where Emily had stood seconds before. Drake's men fired wildly, desperate to hit a target they could barely glimpse. In the chaos, Shadow turned, his body moving with the perfect grace of a creature built for war. He swept back and forth across their path, forcing the attackers to slow down, to bunch up, to lose their speed advantage. Each time they tried to flank, he forced them back. Each time they tried to rush, he broke their momentum with well-placed attacks, snarling warnings that promised far worse if they came closer. Emily ducked into the drainage tunnels, gasping for breath, sweat running down her face in salty rivers. She didn't slow. She couldn't. Not yet. Not until they reached the final fallback point where her father had promised safety would wait. Behind her, Shadow covered the retreat with the kind of lethal, selfless precision that no amount of money, no years of training could buy. It had been forged in battle, in loyalty, in love. Every second he bought her was another second closer to freedom, to victory. And even as the cartel forces closed in, even as gunfire echoed through the broken ruins of Millbrook, Emily felt a fierce, wild hope burning in her chest. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. They'll come with everything they have. They'll come thinking they're the predators. But they'll learn. They'll learn that some prey bites back. Shadow moved ahead of her again, scouting the dark tunnels with flawless discipline. Emily clutched the tablet tighter and followed, knowing that the real war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The storm tunnels swallowed them, a labyrinth of dripping pipes and damp concrete, the air heavy with the scent of rust and old water. Emily ran, her legs screaming, lungs burning, the duffel slamming against her back with every desperate step, but she never let go. Shadow stayed just ahead, ears twitching, head low, scanning every corner with relentless focus. In the dark, with only the faint, bobbing beam of her flashlight to guide them, the world narrowed to one simple mission: survive. The sound of boots and shouted commands echoed faintly behind them, distorted by the tunnel walls, growing louder, closer, hunting them with brutal determination. But Emily knew these tunnels weren't a death trap. Her father had mapped them, fortified them, memorized every blind turn, every hidden passage, and most importantly, he had taught her how to use them. Shadow came to a sudden halt, his body rigid, his nose high, nostrils flaring. Emily slammed into a crouch beside him without even thinking, copying his stance, straining to hear what he sensed. In the far distance, through the maze of pipes, there was the faint clink of metal against metal, soft but deliberate. The hunters were trying to flank them. Emily's heart raced, but her mind stayed clear. Her father's lessons rang through her like iron chimes. When you can't go back and you can't go forward, you go sideways. She spotted a narrow maintenance shaft to the right, half concealed by hanging cables and dripping water, and pointed. Shadow glanced once, sharp and sure, and led the way without hesitation. They slipped into the shaft just as the first team of mercenaries swept around the main bend of the tunnel, their weapons raised, scanning wildly. One of the men knelt, studying the wet floor, frowning at the suddenly vanishing footprints. Radios crackled as orders were barked. Sweep left, sweep right, seal the exits, but they were already too late. Emily and Shadow were ghosts in the walls, moving deeper into the maze where no drones could follow, where no GPS maps would guide them. Only memory and instinct mattered here. The maintenance shaft was tighter, more dangerous, but it also gave them cover. Emily squeezed through a collapsed section where fallen rebar turned the path into a twisted obstacle course, feeling the duffel snag on rusted metal, scraping her arms raw. She bit her lip against the pain and pushed forward. Behind her, Shadow moved like smoke, slipping through gaps barely wide enough for his frame, never making a sound. The noises of pursuit grew muffled and confused, the echoes scattering the enemy teams, disorienting them exactly as James had planned. They emerged into a large junction chamber where 6 tunnels converged around a drained sump pit. On the far wall, lit only by her flickering flashlight, was a massive iron door, half sunken into the concrete, streaked with old graffiti and bullet scars. Emily recognized it instantly, the gateway to Safe House Charlie, her father's final fallback, the last piece of the puzzle. Shadow padded to the door and sat, staring at it, waiting. Emily dropped the duffel, dug through the supplies, her fingers finding the small case marked Final Key. Inside was a battered mechanical keypad, a relic from the Cold War era, no electronics, no remote access, just numbers and gears. She entered the code her father had burned into her mind since she was 8 years old, 927143. The keypad clicked once, twice, then a heavy thunk echoed through the door. It swung inward with a grinding groan of metal against stone. Inside was darkness, not the chaotic, crumbling darkness of the tunnels, but an orderly, purposeful darkness, a safe darkness. Emily stepped inside, Shadow following like her shadow, and slammed the door shut behind them, twisting the massive manual lock with shaking hands. She collapsed against the door for a second, panting, fighting tears, fighting the exhaustion clawing at her limbs. But she didn't have the luxury of falling apart, not yet. The interior of Safe House Charlie was more than a shelter. It was a command center. The walls were lined with steel lockers and weapon racks. Old tactical maps were pinned to corkboards, yellowed but still sharp. In the center of the room sat a reinforced table, and on it a laptop, a radio unit, and a hard drive marked simply Phase 3. Emily didn't need instructions. She set the tablet she had carried all this way onto the table, connecting it to the hard drive. Immediately, the systems came to life, screens flickering, encrypted transmissions firing off into secured channels, a web of evidence stretching outward like a net across the country and beyond. Data began to flood across secure FBI and Interpol lines, financial records, video footage, intercepted communications. Every dirty secret James Anderson had uncovered about Drake, about the cartel, about their backers in government agencies now broadcast in real time, Drake's hidden accounts, their operations, their political allies, their international partners. It was all here, exposed, irrefutable. Outside, the radio chatter from Drake's forces grew more frantic. "We're losing feeds," one voice shouted. "Secure channels compromised," another barked. "Command, command, We have full breach on intelligence assets." Drake himself cursed loud enough to be heard through the radio static. "Pull them out. Get everyone clear. Destroy the evidence if you have to." But it was too late. The trap had sprung. Emily watched the files upload with a growing sense of grim satisfaction. She wasn't scared anymore. She was angry. They had tried to steal her family. They had tried to erase her father's sacrifice. And now, because they underestimated her, underestimated a girl and her dog, they were watching their empire burn. Shadow moved to the entrance, crouching low, ears flat, a deep growl vibrating through his chest. Emily followed his gaze and saw what he had already sensed. Through a tiny crack in the iron door, the movement of shadows. The cartel wasn't retreating, not completely. Drake's most loyal killers were making one last push, one final attempt to silence the evidence by silencing her. Emily pulled the duffel open and found the sidearm her father had packed, heavy and cold in her hands. She had trained with it enough times to know how it kicked, how it pulled left if she wasn't steady, how it would feel to fire it in anger and not just in practice. She took a breath, deep and slow. Not a child's breath, a soldier's breath. She wasn't ready for this, but she would do it anyway. Shadow tensed beside her, and Emily squared her shoulders. They want to end this. Fine. She waited for the first boot to kick the door. She waited for the first face to appear in the breach. And then, without hesitation, she moved. Because sometimes survival wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to fight back. Sometimes you had to teach the monsters that the prey they had cornered was something else entirely, something they should have feared from the start. And in the heart of Millbrook's forgotten ruins, under the weight of her father's legacy and the watchful eyes of a war dog who had never once failed his mission, Emily Anderson prepared to show them exactly what that looked like. The first impact rattled the walls of Safe House Charlie like the thunderclap of an oncoming storm, shaking dust loose from the concrete ceiling and sending tiny tremors through the reinforced floor beneath Emily's boots. She stood in the center of the room, the tactical pistol gripped tight in her hands, her whole body wired, coiled, focused. Beside her, Shadow crouched low, ears flattened, a low growl vibrating through his chest that seemed to echo with the promise of violence. The tablet on the table blinked green, transmission complete. The files were out, the evidence was free. Every single secret Drake and his cartel masters had bled to protect was now racing across secured servers, flooding into the hands of the FBI, Interpol, and governments around the world. There was no putting the genie back in the bottle, no shutting the gates of hell once they had been thrown open. But that didn't mean they would give up quietly. Another slam hit the reinforced door, this time with a hollow metallic boom that told Emily they had brought breaching charges. They weren't coming to arrest or capture or even threaten. They were coming to kill. Not because it would fix anything, the evidence was already gone, but because men like Drake believed in erasing witnesses the way you burned fields after the harvest. No survivors, no testimony, no chance of a future rebellion. Emily felt the fear clawing at the edge of her mind, but shoved it down, deep and hard. She thought of her father, standing tall in his DEA uniform, teaching her how to shoot. She thought of Shadow, bleeding and limping back in those first terrible months after the war, still refusing to quit, to give up, to surrender. She thought of the promises made on quiet, broken nights, promises of protection, of legacy, of fighting for what was right, even when everything seemed lost. The third blast cracked the doorframe, wrenching it outward, the ancient bolts whining under the strain. Through the widening gap, Emily caught glimpses of black-clad figures, faces masked, weapons ready, professional, lethal, no hesitation, no second chances. But this was her home turf. This was her father's last stronghold. This was the final battlefield he had built, not to survive, but to win. The plan clicked into place in her mind, not a conscious thought, but something deeper, something woven into her bones by endless training sessions disguised as games, long talks disguised as bedtime stories. She didn't have to think anymore. She just moved. Emily grabbed the smoke canisters from the duffel, pulled the pins, and hurled them toward the door in 2 practiced motions. A heartbeat later, thick white smoke filled the room, obscuring the line of sight, disrupting the cartel soldiers' perfect formations. Through the haze, Shadow burst forward, a living ghost of war. His body slammed into the first attacker breaching the door, sending the man sprawling backward into his comrades, like a bowling ball knocking down pins. Gunfire erupted blindly, deafening inside the confined space, but it was panicked, inaccurate, wasted. Emily moved along the left wall, low and fast, just as her father had taught her. Shadow herded the attackers, forcing them to bunch together, to trip over each other, to fire wildly at moving shadows instead of real threats. She reached the emergency panel near the floor and slapped the hidden switch. Instantly, high-powered floodlights snapped on, blinding the attackers with searing white brilliance even through the smoke. Disoriented, one man dropped his rifle and clawed at his mask, trying to clear his vision. Another staggered into the open, making himself an easy target. Emily didn't hesitate. She aimed center mass and squeezed the trigger twice, just like she had been trained. The man crumpled with a grunt, his weapon clattering against the concrete. More shouts erupted from the tunnel beyond the door. They were sending in reinforcements, piling bodies into the breach, thinking sheer numbers would overwhelm a girl and a dog. They still didn't understand. Numbers didn't matter here. Precision mattered, training mattered, heart mattered. Shadow weaved through the smoke like a phantom, striking with surgical precision, his movements a blur of snarling fury and cold, ruthless calculation. Every time a gun barrel swung toward Emily's position, Shadow was there first, knocking it aside, disabling the shooter before a shot could be fired. He wasn't killing, he didn't have to. Pain and terror worked just as well. The backup team tried to adapt, tried to sweep systematically through the room, but they never found traction. The smoke, the lights, the narrow angles. Every step they took had been anticipated years ago by James Anderson. He had turned Safe House Charlie into a fortress not of walls, but of traps, a psychological battlefield, and they had walked right into it. Emily fell back toward the secondary escape hatch behind the server racks, just as her father had mapped. She reloaded her pistol with shaky hands, but a steady mind. One shot left if she needed it, but she didn't plan to use it, not unless she had no other choice. Shadow regrouped with her, blood spattering his muzzle, one ear torn slightly from a glancing blow, but his eyes were sharp and unyielding. Emily touched his side briefly, grounding herself, drawing strength from the living embodiment of her father's last hopes. Together they made for the hatch. The attackers realized their mistake too late. As Emily and Shadow slipped into the secondary tunnels, Drake's command vehicle picked up the final data transmissions from the safe house. Full video feeds, recorded facial scans of every operator involved in the breach, weapon serial numbers captured on security cameras, encrypted communications between cartel leaders and rogue government officials. All of it broadcast out, not just to U.S. agencies but internationally, Interpol, MI6, Europol, NSA. The whole world was now watching. Drake shouted orders, desperate, irrational, fury taking over where cold logic had failed. Destroy the safe house, destroy everything. But even as his men rigged explosives to the structure's crumbling walls, even as the first charges detonated and sent shockwaves rippling through the tunnels, it was too late. The evidence had already been captured. The net was closing. Emily and Shadow raced through the old drainage system, dodging falling debris, slipping through side tunnels as smoke and fire choked the main arteries. They emerged into the blinding afternoon sun, battered but alive, just as the first helicopters thundered overhead. But these weren't cartel assets. These were FBI tactical teams, DEA strike units, Arizona State Police mobilizing for the largest organized crime takedown in modern U.S. history. From every direction, law enforcement surged into Millbrook, overwhelming Drake's forces, rounding up mercenaries and collaborators alike. In the chaos, Shadow pushed Emily toward the staging area where Detective Parker waved them in, shouting orders over the din of sirens and gunfire. Parker's eyes widened as he saw her, alive, carrying the tablet, carrying the proof that James Anderson had died to protect. He dropped to one knee, catching her before she collapsed, shouting for a medic, but Emily only shook her head fiercely. "Get the files," she gasped, forcing the tablet into his hands. "Everything's on there, everything my dad found." Parker's face hardened as he understood the weight of what she carried. He radioed for immediate forensic recovery, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Around them, cartel soldiers dropped their weapons and surrendered, the weight of inevitable defeat pressing down harder than any gun barrel. And standing guard over it all, battered but unbroken, Shadow surveyed the battlefield with the eyes of a warrior who had kept his final promise, to fight, to protect, to ensure that even in death, James Anderson's mission would be completed. As the sun set behind the scorched horizon, Millbrook transformed from a battlefield into a monument, not of violence, but of courage, of sacrifice, of loyalty stronger than blood and fiercer than death. Emily sat beside Shadow, resting her hand lightly on his scarred fur, as federal agents secured evidence, arrested traitors, and dismantled a conspiracy that had once seemed invincible. The war was over, but the story, their story, was just beginning. Because some soldiers never stop fighting, and some guardians never stop protecting, especially the ones who walk on four legs, with a heart forged in war and a soul sworn to a promise.